What would you do if the last coin your dying mother pressed into your palm, the only thing standing between you and despair, vanished into the trembling hands of a stranger in the mud? She gave it freely, she gave it gladly, and she had no idea she had just handed her future to a king. One night, one feast, one ragged figure crouched in the freezing dark while noble daughters draped themselves in silk and hunger inside a palace blazing with light. They walked past him like he was smoke, like he was nothing. She didn't. She knelt. And when the great horns of the claiming feast finally rang out across the Silverwood estate, when the doors split open and every head in the grand hall swung toward the entrance, the beggar was gone. In his place stood a king. And the first thing Alpha King Joshua did when he entered that glittering hall was reach into his chest pocket, hold a single silver coin up to the chandelier light, and say 7 words that stopped every heart in the room. Find me the girl who gave me this. This is her story. The Silverwood estate wore its grandeur the way a cruel person wore a smile, elaborately and as a warning. Elena had lived within its walls for 11 years, long enough to know every creak of the back passage floorboards, every draft that knifed through the servants' corridor on a north wind, every particular way the head housekeeper, Marin, could make the word omega sound like something scraped off the bottom of a boot, long enough to have stopped counting the mornings she woke before dawn to a cold that had teeth. Long enough to understand, with the kind of clarity that only the invisible ever develop, that the Silverwood estate were 2 entirely separate worlds stacked on top of each other, sharing the same roof and almost nothing else. Above, crystal. Below, cinders. This particular morning, the morning of the claiming feast, as the entire household had been calling it for 3 breathless weeks, the divide was sharpest she had ever felt it. Elena was elbow-deep in a copper washing basin at 4:30 in the morning, her hands raw and burning red beneath the lye-heavy water, scrubbing the grease from the previous evening's supper pots. Steam rose around her face in pale columns and vanished into the low stone-vaulted ceiling of the kitchen. Outside the single high window above the basin, darkness pressed against the glass like a held breath. The courtyard beyond was invisible, swallowed whole by the winter night. She could hear the estate waking above her. Not the servants, they had never truly slept, but the estate itself. The footsteps of the upper-floor chambermaids dragging steaming water pitchers up marble stairs, the distant percussion of furniture being repositioned in the grand hall, the voice of someone, muffled through 3 floors of stone, shouting instructions in a register that said very clearly, "The stakes are high and someone will pay the price for any failure." That someone, Elena had already learned, was almost always her. "You missed a spot." Marin's voice arrived before she did, cutting through the kitchen noise with an effortlessness of a blade through cloth. The head housekeeper was a tall woman with iron gray hair, pulled so severely from her face that Elena had always privately wondered if it was the tension of the bun that kept her expression so permanently taut. She stood now at Elena's shoulder, holding a candle, and tilted it toward the copper pot in the basin, as if illuminating evidence in a trial. "The left handle. Do you see it? Or do you require spectacles as well as supervision?"
"I see it," Elena said quietly. She did not look up. "You see it," Marin repeated, with a particular brand of contempt that suggested seeing it and doing something about it were the same failure. The Alpha King's delegation arrives by mid-afternoon. The Grand Hall must seat 200 noble guests for the claiming feast. Every surface in this kitchen must shine like a mirror, and you— she let the pause sit, heavy and deliberate— are standing here daydreaming over a pot handle. Elena scrubbed the handle, said nothing. There was a specific art to surviving Marin, and most of it was silence. Not submission. Elena had learned to keep those 2 things separate somewhere in the architecture of herself, in a private room no one else had access to, but strategic quiet. Words given to Marin were words wasted, because Marin was not looking for a conversation. She was looking for kindling, Elena refused to be kindling. When Marin's footsteps retreated toward the pastry station, Elena let out a slow breath and finally straightened, pressing one damp wrist briefly against the ache in her lower back. The kitchen around her was already a controlled chaos of extraordinary scale. 6 long wooden prep tables ran the length of the room, and every inch of them was occupied. Whole roasted haunches of venison rested on iron racks, their mahogany dark skin glistening under the kitchen's firelight. 3 women worked in concert at the far end, their arms dusted to the elbow in flour as they shaped the elaborate braided loaves that were traditional for a claiming feast, each loaf sculpted into the form of 2 wolves with their heads bowed together, a symbol of the bond between an alpha and his chosen. Copper pots of cream sauces bubbled and spat on the great iron range. Bundles of sage and rosemary had been hung to dry above the hearth, and when the heat from the fire reached them, the kitchen filled with a ghost of something wild and green and almost beautiful, the only beautiful thing, Elena thought, in the entire lower half of this building. The claiming feast. Elena had heard the phrase so many times in the last 3 weeks that it had begun to feel less like language and more like weather, something that simply surrounded her, inescapable and indifferent to what she thought about it. Alpha King Joshua. The name moved through the estate like current through water, invisible but felt. He was, by every account, whispered among the servants and proclaimed in the breathless voices of the noble daughters who had arrived in carriages over the last 4 days, the most powerful alpha alive, ruler of the Iron Veil throne, lord of the 7 unified packs, a man who had not taken a queen in the 12 years of his reign, who had turned away every formal courtship, every arranged match, every political alliance that had been laid at his feet like an offering, a man of whom the only physical description that circulated with any consistency was, "His eyes will stop you cold." He had called the claiming feast himself, had sent out the summons to every noble house in the 5 territories, a single black waxed scroll bearing the royal crest containing just 2 sentences, "I will choose, bring your daughters." Elena, of course, had not been brought anywhere. Elena was the one who would spend the evening of the claiming feast ensuring that the noble daughters arrived at the table to find their crystal glasses full, their plates immaculate, and their ambitions undisturbed by any evidence that the food they ate were prepared by human hands rather than conjured from thin air. This was fine. Elena had made her peace with this particular arrangement long ago, in the same room where she kept the distinction between silence and submission. What she had not made peace with, what she had never been able to fully flatten into acceptance, was the particular quality of smallness the noble daughters managed to make her feel in the moments their paths crossed. It had already happened twice in the past 2 days. Lady Seraphina Holt, eldest daughter of the Northern Holt Pack, had passed through the kitchen entrance to complain about the temperature of the bathwater being prepared for her, and had looked at Elena like one looks at a piece of furniture that is slightly the wrong color, not with malice exactly, but with a fundamental incapacity to see her as a person. Lady Cecily Drain had been more direct, pausing as Elena carried a stack of pressed linens through the upper corridor to remark loudly to her companion, "I always forget they let Omegas handle the good cloth. One hopes they've washed their hands." Elena kept walking, had kept her face arranged into a careful neutrality she wore like armor, but she had felt it, the way you feel a splinter you cannot reach.
She dried her hands on her apron and moved to the bread station to relieve one of the older women who had been on since midnight, whose back she could see bowing with fatigue. As she took over the shaping of a loaf, her fingers moving into the familiar muscle memory of the work, her right hand brushed the small pocket sewn into the inner seam of her apron, a hidden pocket, barely larger than her palm, which she had stitched herself from a scrap of the same gray wool as the apron. Inside it, there was a coin. 1 coin, silver, old, worn smooth on one face from years of handling, but still bearing on the other the faint outline of a crescent moon over a mountain, the old marking of the free territories from a time before the unified packs, when a woman could cross a border without papers and begin again. Her mother had given it to her 12 years ago, pressing it into Elena's 10-year-old hands with both of hers, which had already been cold by then, the illness already deep in her chest. "Keep this," she had said, with the fierceness that her weakened voice had somehow still carried. "Not for spending, for remembering. Remember that there is somewhere else. Remember that you can get there." Elena had never spent it, not in 11 years of near poverty, not in the dozens of small crises that had arisen in that time, a winter when the servants' rations had been halved, a sickness that cost her 2 weeks of wages in herbal remedies, the time Marin had docked her pay for a broken dish she hadn't broken. Every time she had pressed her thumb to that worn silver coin and held on. It was her somewhere else. It was her can get there. She folded the bread dough and thought about nothing else for a while, because the kitchen was loud and the day was long and there was work to be done. And in Elena's experience, thinking too precisely about the things you loved made the world's capacity for taking them away feel very close. Outside, the winter dawn was finally beginning. Through the high kitchen window, the darkness softened incrementally to a deep, bruised blue, and then, slowly, reluctantly, to the thin gray of a morning that did not particularly want to be morning. Frost had laced itself across the corners of the glass in the night. Beyond it, if you stood on your toes and craned slightly to the left, you could see the edge of the courtyard, and beyond the courtyard, the iron-tipped fence, and beyond the fence, the world. Elena stood on her toes sometimes, when no one was watching. She did not do it this morning. There was too much to do, and the day had not yet truly begun, and somewhere upstairs, 200 noble guests were waking up in feather beds to prepare themselves for a king who was choosing a queen. Elena rolled the bread, and the kitchen roared with heat and noise around her, and the claiming feast drew closer like a tide that did not care what it swept aside. By the time the first carriages of the evening began arriving at the grand front gate, their lacquered panels catching the torchlight in brief, brilliant flares of amber and gold as they turned onto the estate's main approach, the kitchen had reached a pitch of activity that made the morning's chaos seem peaceful by comparison. Elena moved through it like a current in a river, fast and purposeful and largely unnoticed. She carried platters, she relayed instructions, she retrieved the sauce that someone had set too close to the fire and rescued it before it scorched. She was everywhere and nowhere, visible only when something was needed and invisible the moment it was delivered. A particular kind of existence that she had, over the years, learned to occupy with something approaching grace. It was nearly 7 in the evening when Marin found her refilling the salt cellars at the serving station and delivered the instruction with the particular energy of someone who considered even a mundane command an opportunity of demonstration of authority. "The scrap bin is full," Marin said, not looking at her. "Take it to the outer courtyard, the compost heap, not the gate refuse. I won't have the noble guests smelling kitchen waste when they step out for air." Elena looked at the scrap bin. It was large, wooden, heavy with the accumulated debris of a day's worth of elaborate cooking, vegetable ends, bread heels, rendered fat, bones. Elena looked at the door that led to the outer courtyard. The outer courtyard was on the other side of the estate from the main approach. It was, in winter, approximately as inhospitable as anywhere Elena could think of. She was wearing a kitchen apron over a thin wool dress. She had no coat. "Of course," she said. She hefted the bin. The passage to the outer courtyard ran through the cold larder, past the root vegetable storage, and out through a low wooden door that had never, in all the years Elena had been pushing through it, fit its frame correctly. It had to be shouldered open, which meant arriving at the outer courtyard already slightly off balance, blinking against the shock of outside air. The shock, tonight, was considerable. The cold hit her like something solid, not the brisk, invigorating cold of early autumn, but the deep, voracious cold of midwinter, the kind that moved directly past clothing and skin and seemed to take up residence in the bones themselves. Elena's breath left her in a white plume that the wind immediately snatched away. The courtyard stones beneath her feet were sheened with ice, dark and treacherous, and the mud at the edges where the stones gave way to garden was frozen hard and ridged in the shapes it had taken when last it had been walked upon. She picked her way carefully toward the compost heap at the far end, the heavy bin knocking against her thighs with every step, arms burning with the effort of carrying it. Above her, the estate blazed. That was the only word for it. The great hall's windows, tall, arched, and running almost the full height of the east wing, poured golden light into the winter night with a lavishness that felt almost violent against the darkness of the courtyard. Elena could see through those windows the amber glow of 200 candles on 20 chandeliers, the warm glitter of crystal and silver on white cloth tables, the movement of figures in elaborate dress. The sound of music reached her faintly. A string quartet, she thought, something stately and anticipatory, tuning itself to the mood of an evening that had not yet fully arrived. She tilted the bin over the compost heap. The scraps fell with a soft, unglamorous rush. She stood for a moment, her arms grateful for the reprieve, and watched the windows. She did not know what she felt, exactly, looking at them. Not longing, precisely. She had learned not to long for things that were architecturally impossible, and she had no illusions about her place in the geometry of this evening. Not bitterness, either, though she had earned the right to it. Something more complex and harder to name. Something that had to do with the gap between the world inside those windows and the frozen courtyard she was standing in, and the fact that both were real, and both were part of the estate, and somehow that was just the way things were. She was turning to go back inside when she heard it. A sound, low, rough, almost below the wind, the sound of a person trying not to make sound. She stopped. The far corner of the outer courtyard, where the estate's stone perimeter wall met the back of the garden's ornamental hedge, was deep in shadow. The torches that lit the main approach and the front courtyard did not reach here. There was only the ambient gold spillage from the great hall windows, which ran long and thin across the frozen ground and fell short of the corner by a good 15 feet. She stood very still and listened. There, again, a shift of weight. The particular creak of someone who had been sitting in one position for too long and whose body had finally forced the small movement of complaint. She should have gone inside. Every sensible instinct, every survival-honed calculation she had developed over 11 years of learning when not to draw attention to herself, said, "Go inside. It isn't your business. The outer courtyard is no place for you after dark on the night of the cleaning feast, and whatever is in that corner is not your problem." She walked toward the corner. As she moved closer, the figure resolved itself out of the shadow in stages, first a shape, then a mass of dark tattered cloth, then a person, a man seated with his back against the wall where stone met stone, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around himself in the full-body conservatism of someone trying to keep heat from escaping. His clothes were rags in the most literal sense, a coat that had once been substantial and was now a collection of seams and patches held together by faith, trousers worn through at both knees, boots that had been resoled so many times the original leather was a memory. A rough wool cap was pulled low over his ears. His hands, which were bare, were the blue-white of very serious cold. He looked up when she heard her footsteps. Elena had been looked at many ways in her life. She had been looked at with contempt, with indifference, with the particular species of dismissal that meant, "You do not register as a person to me." She had been looked at with pity, which she liked almost as little. She had been looked at with kindness, by her mother, and occasionally by the older kitchen woman who remembered what it was to be new and overwhelmed in cold. She had never been looked at quite like this. His eyes caught the edge of the great hall's light. Just the barest thread of gold reached the corner, enough to illuminate the planes of his face without softening them, and the look in them was not what she expected. Not desperation, not shame, not the flattened, hollowed expression she had seen on the faces of people at the end of their resources, that particular look of a person who has been worn smooth. He looked at her with an attention so complete and so steady that for a moment Elena forgot that she was the one who had walked toward him and felt instead as though she had been the one discovered. "You shouldn't be out here," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, half swallowed by the wind. "The estate guards do a perimeter of 7:30. If they find you—" "I know." His voice was low, roughened by cold or something else. She couldn't tell. He did not look away from her. Elena glanced back toward the glowing windows of the grand hall. Through the glass, she could see the silhouettes of arriving guests, women in elaborate gowns, the plumes of their headdresses catching the candlelight, men in formal dress, exchanging the particular kind of handshake that was about territory and status and nothing else. She looked back at the man in the corner. His posture, she noticed distantly, was strange, not what you would expect from someone who had been sitting in a frozen courtyard for what must have been hours. He held himself with an unusual stillness, a particular quality of uprightness that survived even the cold and the rags and the obvious discomfort. It nagged at something in the back of her mind, a half-formed thought she couldn't quite catch, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She let it go. There were more urgent matters. Here, she reached into her apron pocket, not the hidden inner pocket, the outer one, where she kept the small folded cloth she used for drying her hands. She unfolded it. Inside were 3 dried figs and a heel of bread she had been saving since midday, her own ration. She had been hungry all day, and she would be hungrier if she gave them up, but the calculation, once made, was not a difficult one. He looked at the food in her hand. Something moved across his expression, something brief and layered and impossible to read in this light. "I can't," he began. "Please don't argue with me. I'm cold and you're colder, and the guards come at 7:30. A silence. Then his bare hand reached out, his bare, blue-white hand, and took the food. He didn't eat immediately. He just held it. "Thank you," he said, and the 2 words were delivered with a gravity entirely disproportionate to the situation, as though he meant something considerably larger than bread and figs. Elena almost turned to go then. She should have. But the cold of his hands, that blue-white cold she had seen when the last thread of gold light crossed them, stayed in her mind and turned over and became something she couldn't unknow. She reached into the hidden inner pocket of her apron. Her fingers found the coin with the ease of long practice, the way your hand always knows where to find the thing it has reached for 10,000 times. She held it for a moment in her closed fist. Somewhere else. Can get there. She opened her fist and looked at the coin. Crescent moon over a mountain. Worn smooth, but there. Still there. She thought of her mother's hands, and how cold they were at the end, and how they had still managed to press that coin in her palm with a fierceness that said, "This matters. You matter. The future is real." She looked at the man in the corner. His hands in the thin thread of light were the same color her mother's hands had been. Elena leaned down and pressed the coin into his palm. She closed his fingers over it because his fingers were stiff with cold, and she wasn't sure he'd hold it otherwise. "Buy warm bread," she said quietly. "There's a bakery 2 streets past the north gate. They stay open for the feast traffic. Go before the half-hour bell, before the guards come around. And—" she hesitated. "Don't come back to this side of the wall tonight. It won't be safe for you here." She straightened and looked at him one last time. Those eyes again. In the thin, borrowed gold of the grand hall's light, they were the color of a winter sky at the moment just before the sun fully sets. Not dark yet, but deepening, carrying the whole weight of what was coming. They were watching her with that same absolute, unnerving attention, and there was something in them now that she could not name, but that made her chest do something unfamiliar. She picked up her empty bin and turned back toward the low wooden door. She did not see him straighten as she left, the cold, tattered posture falling away like water, revealing the line of a man who had never in his life sat in the posture of the defeated. She did not see his right hand open briefly to look at the silver coin she had pressed into his palm, the old coin with the crescent moon, and then close over it again with a care that was not casual. She did not see him reach beneath the tattered coat to touch something at his hip, the hilt of a dagger, its guard worked in iron in the shape of a wolf mid-leap over a crown of thorns, the royal crest of the Iron Veil throne. She shouldered the low wooden door open and went back into the warmth. She was 3 steps into the cold larder when she realized she'd just given away her last coin. She stopped, stood very still in the dark between the root vegetable sacks, pressed one hand flat against the doorframe. Then she breathed out, slow and even, and kept walking. It was already done. And somehow, in a way she couldn't explain and didn't try to, it felt less like a loss than like setting something free. The claiming feast began at 8 o'clock, announced by 3 long notes from the brass horns stationed at the top of the grand hall's entrance stairs, a sound so resonant and so physical that Elena felt it in the floor beneath her feet, even from the kitchen corridor, even through stone and timber, a vibration that traveled up through her bones and settled somewhere in her chest like a bell still ringing after the clapper has moved on. She had no reason to be near the grand hall, every reason in fact to be somewhere else. The kitchen was still full of work, the dessert course not yet fully assembled, and Marin had eyes that could find an idle servant through solid walls. But the kitchen corridor, if you followed it to its end and turned left into the narrow passage that ran behind the serving alcove, opened onto a doorway, a service door, low and plain and kept unlatched during events for the rapid movement of courses in and out, that gave, when opened 3 inches and no more, a direct sight line into the grand hall's southern end. Elena stood in the shadow of that doorway and looked. The hall was magnificent in a way that was almost difficult to process. She had cleaned it, every surface, every crevice, every crystal drop of every chandelier, and still, assembled and lit and populated, it was a different thing entirely. The 20 chandeliers she had polished earlier were suspended now, like small captured suns, each one throwing its light in all directions, and the effect of 20 of them together was something close to daylight. Not the thin, reluctant daylight of a winter morning, but a rich, golden theatrical light that made every surface it touched glow from within. The long tables were dressed in white linen so crisp it seemed to stand slightly away from the table, and the silverware laid on them caught the chandelier light and threw small, sharp arrows of brightness across the ceiling. At the head table, on a raised dais at the hall's north end, stood an empty chair. Not a chair exactly. Elena looked at it more carefully. It was more than a chair. It was a statement, carved from dark wood, its back rising nearly 4 feet, its arms worked with the same wolf-over-crown motif she had seen. She stopped herself. She was not thinking about the courtyard. She was watching the feast. The noble daughters had assembled along the hall's left side, beneath the tall windows that looked out, though they did not know it, over the outer courtyard, where an hour ago a man in rags had been sitting in the freezing dark. They stood in the line that was trying to present itself as casual, and was not succeeding. There were 11 of them, ranging in age from 16 to perhaps 26, and they were collectively a study in the architecture of ambition. Gowns of silk and brocade and jewel tones, hair dressed with gems and feathers, expressions arranged into various configurations of gracious composure, and underneath that composure, a ferocious, undisguised wanting. Lady Seraphina Holt stood nearest the dais, which she had clearly positioned herself to do. Her gown was deep sapphire, her dark hair piled high and threaded with diamonds that caught the light with the aggressive frequency of something specifically engineered to be noticed. Beside her, Lady Cecily Drain in green silk, her chin raised at an angle that suggested she had practiced the angle. Beside her, the others, Elena did not know all their names, but she knew their type, which in 11 years of service had become a form of knowledge as reliable as any other. The room was full, 200 guests in formal dress, standing because the royal guests had not yet been seated, and no one would dare sit before he did. The air was dense with perfume, candle smoke, and the particular human electricity of a large crowd collectively holding its breath. And then the horns sounded again. Not the three-note announcements of before, but a single, sustained, shivering note, longer, lower, a sound that seemed to press down from the room, from above, and through the great hall's main entrance, which stood at the southern end, directly across from Elena's service doorway. The royal guard entered. There were 8 of them, and they moved with the synchronized certainty of people who had done this many times and understood but the entry of a king was a performance as much as a fact. Their uniforms were deep charcoal, edged in silver, their bearing impeccable, their expressions identical in their blankness. They split into 2 columns of 4 at the entrance and arranged themselves on either side of the central aisle that ran between the long tables to the dais. The room was so quiet that Elena could hear the candles. And then he walked in. She almost didn't recognize him. The man who came through the grand entrance was not the man she had known in the outer courtyard, or rather, he was, and that fact was taking a moment to reorganize itself into sense inside her mind. The same face, the same posture, that extraordinary, unlearnable uprightness that she had noticed even through the rags and the cold and the shadow, the quality she had nagged at and couldn't name. The same eyes, which she could see even from the service doorway, even across the full length of the grand hall, because they were the kind of eyes that distance did not diminish. But the rest of him. He was dressed in deep midnight blue, a shade so dark it was nearly black until the chandelier light found it, and then it became a color like deep water with light moving through it. His uniform, because it was a uniform, the dress uniform of the Iron Veil Alpha King, though Elena had never seen it before and knew it only by the gasp that ran through the assembled crowd, was architectural in its precision. The high collar, the double row of silver buttons down the chest, the epaulets worked in silver and obsidian. At his left hip, in a scabbard she could now see clearly, hung the dagger with the wolf over crown hilt, the royal crest of the Iron Veil throne. She had seen that crest an hour ago in the thin borrowed light of the great hall's windows falling across the frozen courtyard floor. The thought arrived and then seemed to dissolve before she could fully form it, too large for immediate comprehension, like a room that is bigger than you expected and requires you to stand in the doorway for a moment before you can actually enter. He reached the center of the hall and stopped. He was not yet at the dais. He had stopped in the precise middle of the room, between the 2 long tables, beneath the largest of the 20 chandeliers. He stood there for a long, still moment, not posed, not performing, just present, and looked around the room with a calm deliberateness that was somehow more arresting than any grand gesture would have been. Then he reached up to the clasp of his traveling cloak, a dark cloak, heavy, that he had worn over the uniform, and undid it with one hand and let it fall. The cloak had been concealing, Elena realized, the full effect of what he was wearing beneath it. Without it, the uniform's quiet devastation was complete. The silver catching the chandelier light, the wolf over-crowned crest at his chest, the particular way he stood in his own authority, the way a mountain stands in weather, not resisting it and not performing against it, but simply, immovably, there. The room dropped. It was not a metaphor and it was not gradual. 200 people descended to their knees with the uniformity of a single decision, the silk and brocade and carefully arranged hair all going down at once, the noble daughters in their jewel-toned gowns folding like flowers at nightfall, even the older lords and pack representatives who had not knelt since their youth going down without hesitation or delay. The sound of it, 200 pairs of knees on stone and polished wood, was softer than Elena expected, barely a whisper, as though even the sound of the kneeling was making itself small. "Alpha King Joshua," said the royal guard captain, his voice carrying across the perfect silence, "ruler of the Iron Veil throne, lord of the 7 unified packs, sovereign of the claiming." Alpha King Joshua. Joshua looked across the kneeling room and his expression did not change. He stood for another moment in the center of the hall, surrounded by the gold and crystal and the silence of 200 kneeling people, and he looked, to Elena's eye, exactly like what he had always been and what she had not known, a king surveying a room that was already, and always had been, his. Then he looked toward the service doorway at the hall's south end. Elena did not understand for a full second that he was looking at her. She understood it in the second after that because his gaze did not move on. It found her in the shadow of the service door, 3 inches of opening, gray wool dress, kitchen apron, flushed from the heat and the cold in alternation, her dark hair escaping its practical knot, and it stopped. And held. The way it had held in the outer courtyard, the way that had made her feel then as though she had been the one discovered. Elena pressed herself back from the doorway, her heart knocking against her ribs with the force she felt in her throat. She stood in the dark of the service passage and breathed and tried to make her thoughts behave, and they did not behave, because the thought at the center of them, the man in the courtyard, the coin, the royal crest she had looked directly at and not recognized, was not the kind of thought that stayed still when you told it to. She had knelt in the mud of the outer courtyard. She had pressed her mother's silver coin into the palm of the Alpha King. She had told him to buy bread. Elena pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed very carefully through her nose and tried to decide whether this was the funniest or most catastrophic thing that had ever happened to her, and arrived at the conclusion that it was, most probably, both. The claiming feast proceeded with a ceremony that felt from Elena's position in the kitchen shadows like watching a tide move, stately, inevitable, indifferent to observation. She went back to work. There was nothing else to do, and work had the virtue of demanding her hands and enough of her mind that the loop of images, the courtyard, the coin, those eyes, the uniform, was forced to orbit at a slight distance rather than occupying the center of her consciousness entirely. She helped plate the first course, she carried pitchers, she kept her head down and her pace steady, and told herself with the firmness of long practice that whatever had happened in the outer courtyard was a private thing, a small thing, already finished. The king had seen her, yes, he had seen her for a moment, across a room, through a service door in the dark. There was no possible way. "Kitchen girl." The voice came from the entrance to the kitchen corridor. Elena was at the far end of the room with her back to the corridor when she heard it. She turned. One of the royal guards stood at the kitchen entrance, not the captain, a lieutenant she thought, by the configuration of the silver on his collar. He was looking at her with a directness that had no hostility in it, but also no warmth. Professional attention, the gaze of someone fulfilling an instruction. "You, gray apron, are you the one from the south doorway?" The kitchen went quiet. Not all at once. It was too large and too busy for that, but in a spreading ripple, the way a stone disturbs still water, conversations and clatterings tossing as proximity to the exchange registered. Elena set down the pitcher she was holding. "Yes," she said. "His Majesty requests your presence in the grand hall." The ripple reached its full extent. The kitchen was now, quite thoroughly, silent. Elena was aware of Marin somewhere behind her and of the sensation of the head housekeeper's stare as a physical pressure between her shoulder blades. She was aware of the other kitchen women and the junior maids and the assistant cook, all of them stopped and watching. She was aware that her apron had a flower streak across it from the bread, and that her hair had largely escaped its knot, and that she was wearing under everything the gray wool dress she had been wearing since 4 o'clock that morning, which was not, by any reckoning, the dress a person wears to enter the grand hall of the Silverwood estate during the claiming feast of the Alpha King. She also became aware in the same moment of a quality of stillness in herself that surprised her. Under the circumstances, she might have expected panic. What she found when she looked inward was something that felt more like the feeling that comes after a very long journey when you finally understand that the road beneath your feet is going somewhere specific. She untied her apron and set it on the nearest table. "I'm ready," she said. She followed the lieutenant through the kitchen corridor and into the passage that led to the grand hall's south entrance, the same passage she had stood in earlier to watch the feast begin. At the door to the hall, the lieutenant stopped and held it open. Elena walked in. She understood in the moment she crossed the threshold and saw the room, truly saw it from inside, without the filter of the service doorway and 3 inches of shadow, that she had not fully comprehended the grand hall before. She had cleaned it. She had seen it through glass. She had glimpsed it in slivers. None of that had prepared her for the hall as it existed right now. The full weight of its light, the full height of its chandeliers, the full presence of 200 people who had, all of them, turned to watch her enter. The kneeling was over. The guests had been seated for the first course, and the noble daughters were arranged near the head table, standing again now, their faces wearing expressions that were almost uniformly some variant of the same thing: confusion. The kind of confusion that lives one layer above outrage and is waiting to see whether it needs to descend. At the head of the dais, Alpha King Joshua stood before the great chair, the carved dark wood, the wolf over crown arms. He had not sat during the feast. Elena understood somehow that he had been waiting. The table before him bore no plate, only a single object, a small, round shape placed on the white linen, catching the chandelier light. A silver coin. Elena stopped walking. She stood in the center of the hall's wide main aisle with the long tables of seated guests on either side of her and the dais at the far end and 200 pairs of eyes on her, and she looked at the silver coin on the table and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something that her mother had pressed into her hands along with that coin 12 years ago in a cold room in a different life. Hope. Not the fragile, rationed kind she had learned to manage. Something wilder and less careful than that. Joshua lifted the coin from the table, held it up between 2 fingers so that the chandelier light fell across it, the crescent moon over the mountain face, catching the gold light and transforming it, briefly, into something between silver and fire. He let his gaze travel, slow and deliberate, across the assembled room, past the noble daughters and their jeweled tones, past the seated lords and representatives, past the servants at the walls, the royal guard at the perimeter, the musicians who had gone still in the gallery above. His voice, when it came, was pitched to carry, not through effort, but through the same quality that made everything else he did seem effortless, the authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice because rooms had always arranged themselves to hear him. "I came here tonight," Joshua said, "not to observe the quality of your gowns, or the depth of your pedigrees, or the cleverness of your courtly manners. I've had 11 years of those things, and I've had enough of them to last several more lifetimes." A pause. The room was so quiet, Elena could hear her own heartbeat. "I came in rags, through the outer gate, in the dark and cold of a winter night. I wanted to know what this house was, what these people were, what it looked like from the outside." Lady Serafina took a small step forward. Her expression was composed and her chin was high, and there was a brightness in her eyes that was either excitement or calculation or both. "Your Majesty," she began, "if I had known—" "You did not know," Joshua said, and the 2 words were gentle and final, as a door closing. That was the point. He looked at the coin again. "I sat in the cold of your courtyard for 3 hours. 200 of your guests walked past me, or around me, or through me, as though I were made of the same substance as the air. 14 of your noble daughters arrived in carriages that passed within 30 feet of where I sat. Not one of them stopped." His voice did not harden. It did not need to. One person stopped. He looked up from the coin. His eyes moved through the room, past the dais, past the tables, past the standing noble daughters, to the south end of the hall where Elena stood, alone in the center of the aisle, flower on her dress and her hair coming down, her hands loose at her sides. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the courtyard across the frozen dark, the way he had looked at her through the service doorway across the lit hall, the same look, as though he had been waiting to arrive back at exactly this. "Step forward," he said, and the words were not a command but an invitation, and somehow that distinction was everything. Elena walked. She had made long walks in her life, the walk to her mother's bedside on the last night, the walk out of the estate's back gate on her first morning as a servant, 11 years old and alone, and determined not to let anyone see her hands shaking. She had walked corridors that felt like judgment and rooms that felt like trials. This walk was different. It was long. The main aisle of the grand hall ran a full 200 feet from the south entrance to the dais, and Elena walked every inch of it at a measured pace, because her legs were steady, and she would not hurry, and she would not falter. On either side of her, the long tables of seated guests watched in silence that pressed against her from both sides, physical as something she could have reached out and touched. She felt the weight of 200 stares and let it pass through her rather than trying to hold it back, the way she had learned 11 years ago to let the cold of the kitchen pass through her in the moments just before the heat of the ovens warmed it away. She passed the noble daughters, Serafina, Cecily, the others. She was aware of their presence on the periphery of her vision, the jewel colors, the feathers, the carefully arranged expressions that were working very hard to remain arranged, and she did not look at any of them. She looked ahead. She looked at the man on the dais. She reached the foot of the dais steps and stopped. Up close, in the full blaze of the chandeliers, Joshua looked different than he had in either the courtyard dark or the crowd distance of the hall entry. He looked, she did not have a better word for it, real. The way things look when you've seen them in preparation and background and finally stand next to the thing itself. The midnight blue uniform, the silver buttons, the wolf over crowned crest. The face she had seen in profile in thin borrowed light and now saw fully, a face that was neither young nor old, but present, completely and wholly present in a way that most faces were not. His eyes, this close, were deep, steady gray, the color of the sky in the hour before dawn, when the darkness has softened but the light hasn't arrived yet. They were watching her with the same absolute attention they had given her in the courtyard, and she still could not fully decide how to hold that attention, what to do with being seen so completely. He held the silver coin out to her. Elena looked at it. The crescent moon over the mountain, worn smooth on one face, the old marking of the free territories. She lifted her hand and he set the coin in her palm. "Your name?" "Elena," she said. He said it back to her, just her name, only that, but the way he said it made it sound like something that had been decided long before tonight, like the final word in a sentence that had been building for a long time. He extended his hand, an open palm, not a command, not a gesture of ownership, an offering, the same openness she had shown him an hour ago in the frozen dark when she had given him bread and figs and her last silver coin. Elena looked at his hand. She thought of her mother's hands, pressing a coin into her palm. She thought of the high kitchen window she had stood on her toes to see through, the iron-tipped fence at the edge of the courtyard, the world beyond it. She thought of somewhere else and can get there. She placed her hand in his. The room, 200 people, nobles and servants and royal guard, let out its collective breath as one, a sound that was barely a sound, more like the room itself releasing a tension it had been holding. Joshua closed his hand around hers, not tight, not possessive, the way you hold something that you've been careful with because you know it matters, firmly enough that it knows it's held, gently enough that it isn't trapped. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the chandelier light fell across both of them like something that had been waiting all evening for this particular arrangement to be made. The cold of the outer courtyard and the gold of the grand hall meeting, finally, in the same moment and the same space. "Lady Elena," said the royal guard captain from his position at the dais stairs, in a voice trained to project into vast spaces and into history with equal facility. Let the record of the claiming feast show that Alpha King Joshua of the Iron Veil throne has made his choice. The noble daughters, to their credit, most of them, bent their knees, not all at once, not uniformly, with the different rhythms of people processing a shock, but they bent. Seraphina's expression, when Elena caught a glimpse of it as Joshua guided her up the dais steps, was complicated in a way that Elena thought, privately, might be the most honest thing she had ever seen the woman's face do. There was anger in it, yes, and outrage, and the particular wounded pride of someone who had arrived absolutely certain of an outcome and been very completely wrong. But underneath those things, just underneath, and she thought Seraphina herself was perhaps not fully aware of it, there was something that might, in different circumstances, in a person with more room for honesty, have been relief. The relief of being known, even in this way, of being looked at truly, even if what the looking revealed was not what you wished it revealed. Elena thought, we are all always being seen more clearly than we know. At the top of the dais, standing before the great carved chair of the Iron Veil throne's representative seat, with the chandelier light falling across them in its fullest and most generous configuration, Joshua turned to face the hall one more time. He held Elena's hand, and she stood beside him, and the 200 guests and the 11 noble daughters and the servants at the walls and the musicians in the gallery all looked up at them with the full weight of an evening's worth of tension, finally, irrevocably resolved. "The feast may continue," Joshua said, and something in the room, something that had been drawn tight since the evening began, released. The musicians began again, tentatively at first, a single violin finding the opening notes of something stately and warm, and then the others joining it, and the sound filled the hall from above and fell across the white cloth tables and the crystal glasses and the faces of 200 people, beginning, slowly, to remember how to breathe normally. Joshua drew Elena's chair back from the table, not the great carved chair, which stood empty and formal at the head of the dais as it always had, as it always would, for the throne itself, but the chair beside it, the consort's chair, which she had dusted without knowing it was hers 3 days ago in the morning Marin had assigned her to the grand hall preparations. She sat. She had set this table. She had polished these glasses, laid these linens, arranged these candles. She knew every inch of this dais from below, from the perspective of the invisible. She looked out at the hall from above it now, from the height of the dais, and the hall looked different from here, larger somehow, and also less intimidating, more human. All those faces looking back at her, caught between astonishment and recalibration, and none of them more real or more formidable than they had been when she had been carrying platters past them an hour ago. Just people. People adjusting to a thing they had not expected. Elena knew how to do that. She had been adjusting to unexpected things her entire life. Joshua sat beside her. The royal guard took their positions. The first course was already on the tables. She knew this menu, had helped prepare every dish on it, and the sounds of silver on china and the low reinstatement of conversation began to fill the hall, softly at first, then with growing confidence, the way warmth returns to a room after a door has been opened to the cold and then closed again. She pressed her thumb briefly to the silver coin in her palm. Crescent moon over a mountain. Old marking of the free territories. Somewhere else. Can get there. She looked out at the great hall, the chandeliers, the tables, the faces, the music, and thought, I am already there. I am already somewhere else entirely. I have been walking here my whole life without knowing it, and my mother's coin had the shape of it all along, and the mountain on its face was not a direction, but a reminder that some things hold their ground. She set the coin on the table in front of her, where the chandelier light could find it and the crescent moon over the mountain could be seen. Joshua glanced at it, then at her. "Keep it," he said. "I am," she said. Outside, the winter night pressed against the tall arched windows of the grand hall, and the outer courtyard lay dark and empty in the cold, and the torches burned along the main approach, and the frost was white on the cobblestones, and in the low stone-vaulted kitchen below the hall, Marin was telling someone to hurry up with the second course, in a voice that carried through stone and timber with its familiar absolute authority. And in the grand hall, lit by 20 chandeliers and the warmth of the thing that had already irreversibly begun, Elena, who had entered the evening as a kitchen maid and would leave it as something she did not yet have the full shape of, sat at the high table of the Silverwood Estate's claiming feast and ate her dinner. She ate it warm, at a table that had been set for her arrival long before anyone knew she was coming. And in the morning, the cold, reluctant, gray-bright winter morning that would come as mornings always did, indifferent to what had changed overnight, there would be much to learn and much to do, and a future that was larger and stranger and more fully her own than anything her mother's coin had ever managed to represent, though it had tried, faithfully, for 12 long years. But that was the morning. Tonight, there was the feast, the light, the music, the silver coin catching the chandelier's gold and holding both. Tonight, Elena was home. The end.